Good morning, RMA members, and welcome to our first virtual program. It's been 3 months since we suspended our speaker program, and today we're very happy to be back. We are planning to do these programs every week. Today's program is closed to RMA members and a few invitees, friends of the speaker. Next week, we plan to go public. We actually have a capacity of 500. Now, as a participant, as an attendee, all you see is a blank screen, and you cannot speak until you're recognized. I want everyone to look at their screen. It's a black screen, and at the bottom you'll see a few icons. And one of them says Q&A, and this is how we're going to handle the questions today. During the presentation, if you have a question, click onto the Q&A and type your question. We're not going to have live questions. So you type your question, and it'd be nice if you put your name on it. You may type them anonymously, your choice. At the end of the presentation, I will read as many questions as possible, one by one, and our speaker will respond. So be alert as you listen to this presentation. When you have something you'd like to hear more about, type your questions. I want to introduce Jerry Gibeon, who organized today's program, and he will introduce our speaker. Jerry.
Thank you, Hollister. David Richards, our speaker for today, is an RMA member and has been a friend of mine for over 25 years. He's a retired real estate attorney in New York City who has done a wide range of projects, including the 13-year-long negotiation for the High Line in New York City. Graduated from Yale, Cambridge, and his collection at the Yale Library is the world's largest collection. Last January, David was honored in the Wall Street Journal as one of 16 winners of the Who's Who Lifetime Awards. David today is going to talk about Kipling, the Bard of Two Empires. And for some of you who are not familiar with Kipling, perhaps his most famous work is Gunga Din. And Kipling was the first writer in English to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. Much less known is that Kipling married an American and that his children were born in a house in Brattleboro, Vermont. David will explore the long and fateful relationship of the Bard of the British Empire with the rising American empire. I've said my piece, and now over to David.
Good morning. This is a portrait of Kipling done in 1899 when he was only 33 years old. We'll have a number of illustrations through. I'll speak about them briefly, and we'll have a bit of a break then from the words with the images. When the British forces fighting with the Americans in the First Gulf War had t-shirts printed up, they chose the last verse of the Kipling poem titled The Young British Soldier, which recalled an earlier war in the Middle East. When you're wounded and lying on Afghanistan's plains, and the women come out to cut up what remains, just roll to your rifle and blow out your brains and go to your God like a soldier. Verses like this, in the soldier's argot employed here, and in the more refined cadences of recessional, noting the British Empire's dominion over palm and pine, earned Kipling the epithet, the Bard of Empire. When he passed away shortly after the death of Queen Elizabeth's grandfather, George V, one London newspaper headlined, "King takes his trumpeter with him." The next image is a map of Kipling's America, from Vermont down to Washington, D.C. Beyond his reputation within the British Empire, most did not know that he had many links with this country. As Jerry mentioned, an American wife and his half-American children. His first home up in Brattleboro, Vermont, shown on this map, which you can rent today for a family holiday if so inclined. It was designed by an architect in his New York City club, The Century, in which he maintained membership until his death, though never attending the club after he left the United States in 1899. Because of the volume of his fan mail, he even had his very own personal U.S. post office at the base of his driveway, arranged for by his friends, also members of The Century, some serving in President Cleveland's cabinet down in Washington. Not marked on this map is New Haven, where there was even an undergraduate Kipling club at Yale in the 1890s. The members invited him down to dinner there from Vermont. He answered them not with an abrupt refusal, but with a poem voiced in the Irish brogue of Mulvaney of his story, Soldiers 3, which began, "Attend ye lasses of Swate Parnassus, and wipe me barn tears away, for I'm declining the pleasure of dining with the boys of Yale on 14th May. There's a more familiar Yale connection. The words of the Whiffenpoof song, "We're poor little lambs who have lost our way," are largely taken from a Kipling poem called Gentleman Rankers. He was never shy about going public with his advice to Americans. What you see is a pirated copy, an explanation by a Chicago minister of what he thought the white man's burden meant. This pamphlet exists only in 4 copies now. This poem urged America in the Spanish-American War and its conquest in the Philippines to take up the effort and cost of imposing Western civilization in its new possessions, as the British were thought to have done by the British across their own empire. And Kipling had mailed the text in advance to President Theodore Roosevelt as both political and moral advice. If the US was going to prosecute what Kipling's friend, the Secretary of State, John Hay, called the splendid little war, then it ought to, quote, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need." Kipling's most famous poem, If, published in 1910 and printed following a story about George Washington, was thought to be a tribute to our first president. 6 years later, in his poem 1916, The Question, he effectively asked how President Wilson and the United States could stand aside in the First World War, letting Britain and its allies fight the Germans, whom Kipling had famously styled Huns back in 1898. Fight them without American help in defense of Anglo-Saxon values. When the United States did enter the conflict, he spoke to our troops in Europe. This, the pamphlet distributed by the YMCA. 50,000 copies of this little pamphlet were printed in 1918. Only 4 are known to exist today. In some very real sense, Kipling was a bard of our empire too. And today, our op-ed writers often quote him, not only on war, but on all manner of topics. Pithy epigrams easily located in Bartlett's Book of Quotations. How often have you seen or heard quoted the phrases, "East is east and west is west, never the twain shall meet," or "The female of the species is more deadly than the male," or "A woman is only a woman, but a good cigar is a smoke," or, as Jerry mentioned, "You're a better man than I am, Gunga Din," or even, "That's another story." Those of you who have seen the prize-winning movie 1917 will know that the film is but 5 minutes old when Major Aaronmore, played by Colin Firth, says to the party of 2 soldiers that he's sending off on a dangerous mission, quoting Kipling, "Down to Gehenna or up to the throne, he travels the fastest who travels alone. Kipling is said to have bequeathed more familiar quotations to our language than any other writer since Shakespeare. What teenagers are not exposed to the hammering exhortations of "if"? My birthday card from my parents at age 21 was comprised simply of the poem's text. Whose grandchildren today can avoid the many Disney movie versions of the Jungle Books, or by those of us who know them, being read the Just So stories? Kipling works recently chosen by the Grolier Club as 2 of the 100 greatest children's books in English. This is an image of Kipling's father to your upper left, his mother to the right, and the infant in his crib in India. Let's take a more bird's eye view of his life and times. He was born in Bombay on New Year's Eve in 1865, the son of the top-hatted gentleman there, John Lockwood Kipling, who was an employee of the Victoria and Albert Museum and a skilled ceramicist and sculptor. He did the clay bas-reliefs, which illustrated Kim on its publication in 1901, and he was sent to the Raj to teach young Indians how to make pottery for export. Rudyard's mother, Alice, up there on the right, was one of 4 clever Scottish sisters who all married talented men. One to the great pre-Raphaelite artist Edward Burne-Jones, in whose home Kipling played as a child, and later, as a young adult, wrote the first draft of If. A second sister to the president of the Royal Academy, Sir Edwin Poynter, and a third to an English Midlands manufacturer whose son Stanley Baldwin became the British Prime Minister 3 times, but could never convince his cousin Rudyard to be poet laureate or be knighted, because Kipling believed that would cramp his style in expressing political opinions, as he sometimes did in his poetry. The first language of this little 6-year-old boy was Hindi, taught by his ayah, and he was sent at that age to Southsea in England to be boarded, a practice often used by Anglo-American parents to prevent their children from succumbing to illness in India, where the youngster and his little sister Alice stayed for the next 6 years without visit from their parents. Shortly thereafter, he was admitted to a military school preparing boys for the army. A kindly headmaster revived the school newspaper and made the boy its editor, where his first poems and essays were published. This is an issue of the United Services College Chronicle with Life in the Studies, Kipling's first essay there. He shocked his teachers by announcing that his favorite poet was the disreputable Walt Whitman. His experiences at the United Services College were later used in his schoolboy story collected as Stalky & Co., published in 1899. He also met and loved there his first girlfriend, who became the model for Maisie in his first novel, The Light That Failed, in 1891, published in Lippincott's magazine. On the left, you see a page of that manuscript, now in my collection at Yale, marked up by the author. And on the right, the first page of the story as it appeared, filling the entire issue of Lippincott's monthly magazine. While his stocky roommates became generals, Kipling's parents could not afford Oxbridge, so his father got him a job in Lahore, which is now in Pakistan, as assistant editor of the local newspaper, the Civil and Military Gazette. He was not quite 17 years old and number 2 on a 2-man newspaper staff. For what he called 7 years hard, he worked as a reporter in northern India, later moving to the Gazette's sister newspaper, The Pioneer, in Allahabad. Here's a copy of a page from the Pioneer Mail, the weekend version, with Kipling's poem, The Song of the Women. He wrote fillers when the news was too short for the columns, and in 1886 published a pamphlet of poems, which he advertised for sale by postcards to the Gazette's subscribers. It was entitled Departmental Ditties. This is the first edition, and it was wrapped in red tape. We get the expression red tape from the British administration. And it was made to look, therefore, like a government document. His first name, his name is just visible there at the bottom as the author. Kipling took his annual leaves in the hill town of Simla, where the British administrators went in the hottest of the summers up in the hill for the cooling. And that town featured in many stories that he wrote for the papers. These stories were later collected as Plain Tales from the Hills, published in 1888, a month after his 22nd birthday. This is a photo of the cover of the first edition of Plain Tales from the Hills, and Kipling's father, John Lockwood Kipling, did this illustration. He wrote at a frenetic pace and was invited by the proprietor of the newsstands, having the monopoly of that business at Indian railway stations, to publish paperback collections of his stories, priced at 1 rupee each. In 1888, he published 6 collections of them, including Soldiers 3, The Phantom Rickshaw, and Wee Willie Winkie. Here are the covers of 3 of those 6 paperbacks. The drawings, again, by his father, and with illustrations on the first 2 prominent of the Indian symbol for good luck, the Indian, the Ganesh, Indian elephant. These paperbacks were consumed by their traveling readers and left in the train carriages, picked up and read by later passengers. And this spread his fame all over the subcontinent of the Raj, joined by the remarkable railway system built by the English. In order to further his literary career, he decided he needed to travel to the imperial capital, London. So he sold his copyrights to his publishers, and he embarked in March 1889. He traveled via Rangoon, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Japan to San Francisco, where the newcomer was invited to the Bohemian Club, of which you may have heard, and he wrote a poem as his thank you, the original displayed for years on the clubhouse walls. He reported back to his old newspaper on his travels, and his colorful description of Yellowstone National Park was used as a voiceover by Ken Burns in his PBS documentary on the American national parks. In his article, The Man of the Future, Kipling celebrated the American melting pot and proclaimed that man, the man of the future, to be, quote, the Anglo-American German Jew, with, quote, just the least little kink in his hair now and again. He'll carry the English lungs above the Teuton feet that can walk forever, and he will wave long, thin, bony Yankee hands with the big blue veins on the wrist from one end of the earth to the other. He'll be the finest writer, poet, dramatist, especially dramatist, that the world as it recollects itself has ever seen. There is nothing known to man that he will not be, and his country will sway the world with 1 foot as a man tilts a seesaw plank. Kipling was a fervent admirer of Mark Twain and stopped in Elmira, New York, and interviewed Twain, learning that a sequel to Tom Sawyer was planned. Twain later wrote his impressions of their 2-hour meeting, during which 4 cigars were smoked. Kipling was, quote, a stranger to me and all the world, and remained so for 12 months. Then he became suddenly known and universally known, close quote. Later he joked of Kipling, between us, we cover all knowledge. He covers all that can be known, and I cover the rest. Kipling became an almost immediate star in the London literary firmament, the 12 months that Twain mentioned in passage, with the reprinting of these very Indian Railway Library stories. His literary agent there tripled his income, always good to have a good broker, in the first 3 months, vending poems and stories to newspapers and magazines. This is a copy of Macmillan's magazine with his story, My Lord the Elephant, which you can just see there is the first of the contents. Henry James, then an expatriate in Britain, said, Kipling strikes me as the most complete man of genius, as distinct from fine intelligence, that I have ever known. On this side of the pond, James's brother, the great American psychologist William James, said Rudyard was, quote, more of a Shakespeare than anyone yet in this generation of ours. Mark Twain was to confess that Kipling's name and Kipling's words always stir me now, stir me more than any other living man. Kipling was soon introduced to Walcott Balestier, his two names reflecting the two great Connecticut families which had produced governors of this state. Balestier was an agent in London for the Canadian pirate publisher John Lovell and for McClure's magazine. This is an image of Walcott Balestier. Because there was no international law then protecting Kipling's copyright, his books were being pirated in the US. This means printed without his permission, and more significantly, without payment or royalties. Balestier had the idea of arranging for the Canadian publisher Lovell to print the Indian Railway Library stories in the United States from their Indian paperback text for a flat payment, meaning before other American pirates reprinted them, and of course they did, at least Kipling made some money. This is Lovell's edition. See Lovell at the bottom of the spine there of Kipling's departmental ditties and barrack root ballads and other verses. At one point, Kipling had 32 lawsuits going on in the American courts against publishers here printing his old works without permission. But he lost them all and only secured copyright protection in this country, which was prospective only, not retrospective, with the passage of the Hague Convention in 1891. He became close to Walcott Balestier, and together they wrote a novel of adventure set partly in India and partly in the American West, called The Nalaka. This is the United Kingdom first edition of Nalaka. Walcott's mother and sister had traveled to London to be with their son and brother, Walcott, and all were devastated by his early death from typhoid. Kipling was then in the South Seas trying to visit Robert Louis Stevenson. He failed to make it before Stevenson died, heard the news, and hurried back. And within the week, he'd married Walcott's sister, Carolyn or Carrie, at a small wedding where Henry James gave her away. This is a portrait of Carrie. Rudyard, age 26, and Carrie, age 29, set off on their honeymoon. Kipling on that trip finishing the last chapters of the Nalaka, which were to complete its magazine serial publication before it came out in the hardcovers you just saw. In Yokohama, they discovered that the bank which had issued the letter of credit on which they were traveling had failed, taking with it Kipling's entire savings. On vouchers from the Thomas Cook Travel Agency, they managed to get back to Carrie's mother in Vermont, where Carrie had their first child, Josephine, and lived in a rented house called Bliss Cottage, where the first chapters of the Jungle Book were imagined while snow reached the windowsills. That cottage was now too small, and so the Kipling couple bought 10 acres of land on the Connecticut River from Carrie's brother Beatty in what is now Dummerston, 5 miles outside of Brattleboro. Through his friends at the Century Club in New York, where he became the youngest member ever elected to that date, he engaged a New York City architect, Henry Russell Marshall, who was himself a student of the great American architect H.H. Richardson. He designed this house shown here in the Vermont snow. The young couple called the house Nalaka, like the novel he had written with Walcott, an Indian word meaning 9 lakhs, L-A-K-H-S, of rupees, the way we would say a million or nowadays a billion. Rudyard's general seclusion in Vermont made him both inventive and prolific, although they were visited one Thanksgiving by Arthur Conan Doyle on a tour to furbish British-American relations, and he and Rudyard played golf in the snow with red-painted golf balls. Doyle later shipped Kipling a set of Scandinavian skis, said to be the first arriving in Vermont. This is an album of Kipling at Malacca, and you see him skiing in the upper right-hand corner, below on his bicycle. His first fruits, written for little Josephine and then published in Mary Mapes Dodge's children's magazine, St. Nicholas, later became chapters in both the Jungle Books. Please advance it, Hollister. This is the poster of the Century Company's edition, American edition of the Jungle Books. He wrote The Day's Work, a book of short stories, and Captains Courageous. Hollister, advance again. This is a movie, a poster from the dust cover from the 1939 movie version of Captains Courageous. Some of you may have seen it, starring, as the dust cover shows us, Freddie Bartholomew, Spencer Tracy, and Lionel Barrymore. This was a novel about the fisherman. Back one, Hollister, please. This was a novel about the fisherman down in Gloucester, Massachusetts, whose fleet doctor was the man who delivered Carrie Kipling's first two babies. Kipling announced more than once that he was, quote, the only man living who could write the great American novel. Although the Jungle Book may be the closest he got, with both its narrative driven by tooth and claw, the naturalist version of Teddy Roosevelt and Jack London, and its vivid rendition of the question for Mowgli, how to find the proper balance between the claims of civilization and the claims of the wild, written in a still young nation debating that balance where the frontier, Frederick Jackson Turner soon announced, was about to close. Many new poems, first published in magazines, were later collected in a book called The Seven Seas, and then in Barrack Room Ballads, finished in 1892, including Mandalay and Gunga Din, his admiring portrait of a lowly Muslim water carrier. He even wrote the first draft of Kim on that crest of a Vermont hillside overlooking the Connecticut River. India was still providing him his creative nourishment, but note that all these early mature works were the glorious product of his American years. One little boy wrote him a fan letter from Kentucky, hoping for a second Jungle Book. And Kipling responded with an illustrated letter from Brattleboro, which you will see here. He told him is what Santa Claus looks like when he visits us here. This is Kipling's drawing of Santa Claus in a letter in which he said that the gifts were so heavy that Santa had to stop in Vermont to change out the reindeer for moose. This American idol came to an abrupt end in 1899 when newspapers reported that President Cleveland had threatened to invade Canada if Great Britain insisted, in violation of the Monroe Doctrine, on enforcing its rights against Venezuela in a border dispute with British Guiana. Kipling simply could not fathom how his adopted country and Great Britain might come to blows. He said, quote, this folly puts an end to my good and wholesome life here, close quote. That international upset was compounded by a family dispute with his brother-in-law Beatty, who had been engaged to build the Kipling's house in Malacca and whom his sister thought was skimming the construction funds. This led to a mild physical altercation between the men, which led to a lawsuit, which became a sort of O.J. Simpson trial of its era, with dozens of reporters filing stories about the famous English author's troubles. Here's an image of the newspaper report at Kipling's trial, Kipling in farce comedy. These two disturbances finally impelled Kipling to leave the United States forever, abandoning his house and much of his library of books, some of which are now in my collection at Yale. Kipling was to lament, quote, there are only two places in the world where I want to live, Bombay and Brattleboro, and I can't live in either. The celebrity author was warmly welcomed back in England. This is a cover of the monthly magazine, The Bookman, 4 years after Kipling arrives in London, and this is a woodcut of him on the cover. The couple's only son, John, was born there, unlike the two girls who'd been born in America, in 1897. And his father poetically weighed in on world affairs with Recessional that year, composed as a prayer and warning against British arrogance and imperial overreach, addressed to his new English countrymen. This is an image, the first page of the first United States edition of Recessional. In the United States, John Hay summed up the reaction on both sides of the imperial question about this poem. It has touched everybody, not merely the critical people, as the one utterance of the year worthwhile. 2 years later came what we've previously discussed, The White Man's Burden, addressed, as we had noted, to Kipling's former countrymen in America. The year before, in 1898, the Kiplings traveled to South Africa for their winter holiday, a virtually annual tradition. Kipling didn't like the cold in Britain, having grown up in India, which was to continue until 1908. This is an image of the Kipling family on shipboard, here returning from the Cape in 1907 on the Kenilworth Castle. Kipling's in the back, sort of obscured, with the flat cap and the pipe. There, in South Africa, they stayed in the Woolsack, which is a house on Cecil Rhodes's estate in Cape Town. Often meeting the diamond tycoon there in the evenings, they advised Rhodes on his scholarship enterprise, constantly evolved through 8 different successive last will and testaments, and known today as the Rhodes Scholarships. At one such discussion in the Woolsack, shown here in a postcard, a fairly substantially sized house, not as big as Rhodes's, of course, it was Carrie Kipling who persuaded Rhodes to add 50 pounds to the scholarship amount, in recognition that many of the Americans could not afford to go home over the Oxford vacations and needed a stipend to live between terms. Since my own scholarship 50 years ago in Cambridge, called the Caseby Fellowship, was modeled on the Rhodes and happily plugged its financial support to the Rhodes level, I remain personally grateful to Mrs. Kipling. Kipling also traveled to South Africa during the Boer War, encouraged by his friend Rhodes, who wanted a Cape to Cairo swath of land painted red on the map. And Kipling there reported, with Conan Doyle as it happens, as a correspondent for a few weeks on the army newspaper at Bloemfontein called The Friend. Here is an image of these war correspondents, Kipling in the center. Rudyard turned down an offer from Lord Northcliffe, the owner of the Daily Mail in London, to report for that newspaper. But instead, he gave the paper the copyright to the poem, The Absent-Minded Beggar, if, and on condition, that the paper would monetize the poem to raise a fund for widows and orphans of the British soldiers who were certain to die there. Here is a copy of a triptych. This is the cover image, which the Daily Mail Fund published on paper and on silk. And then there was a fancy fringed version when Lily Langtry gave a recitation in 100 copies. Northcliffe did what Kipling asked, licensing the right to perform the piece, recited by the likes, as I say, of Lily Langtry, and set to music by Arthur Sullivan of Gilbert and Sullivan. And also, Northcliffe commissioned souvenir items of pottery, which were decorated with a sepia decal of a stanza from Kipling's manuscript of the poem, which he had sent the newspaper, and which is illustrated inside this triptych, and also included the famous illustration by Caton Woodville of the absent-minded beggar, a bandage around his head, his topi at his feet, rifle to the ready. The most fabulous of these items is this tea set from my collection, with over 60 different examples gathered over several years on eBay from sellers, many of them descendants of the Empire's soldiers in this war, from not only Great Britain, but South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. You see that every piece has on it effectively a decal with the portion of the manuscript, and Caton Woodville's illustration of the absent-minded beggar, both on the teapot and on the tea tray, the sugar and the creamer to the left and the right. This fundraising effort was no small thing. The Daily Mail Fund raised £340,000 before its liquidation in 1903. This is well over 10 million pounds in present value, enough to build a 300-bed veterans hospital in Hampshire. Kipling wrote his American friend, Harvard professor Charles Eliot Norton, in 1900, quote, "It's the first time I ever set out of malice aforethought to sell my name for every blessed cent it would fetch. And the result, so far as women and children are concerned, is good." In 1902, the Kiplings bought Bateman's, a house built in 1634 and located in rural Sussex. This is a picture of it today, owned by the National Trust, of which we'll speak again, and you can visit it. Life there was good, except for one last visit to the United States in 1899. Both Kipling and his oldest daughter, Josephine, the first one to be born in Vermont, became terribly ill. The 8-year-old girl died and is buried today in Long Island. Kipling hung on in a New York City hotel, ignorant of his child's death, for fear of telling him might kill him, while thousands of fans stood outside on the whole Hotel Grenoble on 7th Avenue to hear the frequent bulletins on his health. He never again returned to America. His writing began more frequently to reflect his awareness of the British Empire's perilous position as the Germans increased their naval strength. British statesmen, with their acute sensitivity to the balance of power on the continent, had concluded before the turn of the 20th century that they must never be against the United States militarily. And, like Kipling, for different reason, with white man's burden, the British government supported the Spanish-American War, even when Spain pressed Britain hard to get America to back off. Reciprocity was realized the next year when an American president of Dutch extraction named Roosevelt did not, as the Dutch-descended Boers in the Cape had hoped, speak up for them in fighting British forces in the Boer War in South Africa. Indeed, Kipling joined for about a decade in the 1890s with Cecil Rhodes and Arthur Conan Doyle in actively pushing an Anglo-American reunion, ending what they all considered the very unfortunate and stupid divorce that had occurred under King George III something over a century before. The new nation's capital, Rhodes proposed, might even be 5 years in Westminster and 5 years in the District of Columbia. This image is a Piers soap ad reading, "An Anglo-American alliance would change the complexion of the universe," an ad in Life magazine in 1898. No one, it was thought, would dare take on the new colossus, and what Kipling had styled the lesser breeds without the law could sort themselves out with tiny wars on the periphery. In 1907, Kipling was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, the first English language author, as Jerry Gibeon mentioned, to be so recognized, and still the youngest at age 41 ever to have won that award. This came between the bookends of his twin volumes of poetry and prose on English themes, going back to Roman times, Puck of Pook's Hill in 1906, and Rewards and Fairies in 1910. The latter included the famous poem If, an exhortation of self-control and stoicism, which is arguably Kipling's most famous poem, and which in a poll conducted by the BBC in 1995 was voted the United Kingdom's favorite poem. Also in 1907, at the awarding of honorary degrees at Oxford University, the small band of honorans was led by Kipling and his old friend, Mark Twain. You see Twain there to the right with his corncob pipe, Kipling with his beret there in the middle, and that is the Salvation Army's General Booth in the center. These two, Twain and Kipling, first as reporters and then as novel writers, had reached the top of their profession in their respective countries without the benefit of any college education, and were now about to be given honorary degrees at Oxford. Kipling reported that the group, which also included the French composer Saint-Saëns and the sculptor Auguste Rodin, were, quote, very much hurried and limitlessly Kodaked. Here is one of those Kodaks, a photo of Kipling. You can see he is behind Twain, and just see he has a dark mortarboard and a mustache there, partly covered by Twain's mortarboard. Twain in the lower left-hand corner with his head tilted slightly forward. As far back as 1902, Kipling had attacked the Kaiser as a threat to Britain and made the first use of the term Hun as an anti-German insult, using Kaiser Wilhelm's own words used about the actions of German troops in China during the Boxer Rebellion, to portray Germans as essentially barbarians. When the First World War commenced, Kipling joined other writers, including Doyle, in agreeing to write propaganda for the government agency charged with conducting it. On the side, he wrote poems and gave them free to the Times of London and other British periodicals, so that no one could ever accuse him of profiting from the war. We'll speak more about that at the end of the talk. More tragically, his youngest and only son, John, here is John in uniform, whose eyesight had disqualified him from his father's favorite service, the Navy, was given an appointment in the Irish Guards through Rudyard's friendship with that unit's patron, Lord Roberts, who had been befriended in the Boer War. On the second day of the Battle of Loos in September 1915, John was killed, and his body has still never been retrieved from the French mud, despite several reports of the same, which repeatedly proved to be false. It broke his parents' hearts. Here's a picture of the Kiplings at the cemetery at Loos. The father later undertook to write a 2-volume history, 2 volumes of his son's regiment, the Irish Guards in the Great War, which he confidently but wrongly predicted to his secretary would be his greatest work. You, of course, have probably never heard of it. After the Great War's end, in a poem entitled Epitaphs of War, Kipling was to write bitterly, "If any question why we died, tell them because our fathers lied." Some of you may have seen the PBS movie made for television a few years ago, co-produced with the BBC, titled My Boy Jack. Here's the DVD starring Carey Mulligan as his mother. Carey Mulligan as his sister, Kim Cattrall as his mother, David Haig as the father, and Daniel Radcliffe of Harry Potter fame as John. This movie tells this story, although it's historically wrong in suggesting that the father had pushed the boy into battle. Fully 100,000 boys joined up, English boys, before Christmas 1914, including John, because of course it was all going to be over by then, by Christmas. And the lesson of the American Civil War, the effect of machine guns on troops advancing, had not been learned by the British General Staff. Perhaps that was the, quote, lie of the fathers which Kipling denounced, that the British Army was prepared for any war, which it was not. Partly in response to John's death, Kipling joined the Imperial War Graves Commission, responsible for organizing and building the garden-like cemeteries found to this day dotted across the Western Front, which commission Winston Churchill was to chair. Kipling's main contributions to the project were the selection of the biblical phrase, "Their name liveth forevermore," found inscribed on the stones of remembrance in the larger war cemeteries, and his suggestion of the phrase, "known unto God," on the headstones of the unidentified servicemen. He accompanied King George V in 1922 on the monarch's visit to these memorials, and was later to anonymously draft the very first broadcast royal Christmas message delivered by the king via the BBC's Empire Service in 1932. Although skeptical of Wilson's 14 points and the efficacy of the League of Nations, he continued to hope that the United States would abandon isolationism, that the post-war world would be dominated by an Anglo-French-American alliance, and that his friend Theodore Roosevelt would again become president. All these hopes were frustrated. And Kipling was deeply saddened by TR's death in 1919, believing him to be the only American politician capable of keeping the US a contender in the game of world politics. His poem of remembrance about Roosevelt, titled Greatheart, compared him to Greatheart in Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, and ends, "Let those who would handle make sure they can wield his far-reaching sword and his close guarding shield. For those who must journey henceforward alone have need of stout convoy, now Greatheart is gone." He continued, as a public man, to speak out on political issues. He was against fascism and called Britain's Oswald Mosley a bounder and an Arabist. The author used the ancient Indian symbol of the swastika on his books since producing the Indian railway library titles back in the Raj. But when Hitler appropriated it as an Aryan symbol of superiority of the master race, Kipling swiftly instructed both his English and American publishers, Macmillan and Doubleday respectively, to stop using that symbol on Kipling's covers. This is the Morning Post from November 13th, 1933, the morning after Kipling won the plebiscite in Germany, approving that country's withdrawal from the League of Nations. You see that lead article on the left. And next to the news story is Kipling's poem, Bonfires on the Ice, an allegory about appeasement policies from the home government of the day, which, being built upon falsehood, might cheer and deceive for a time, but in the end, fall through the foundations on which they are built, like a bonfire on ice. Now, age 70, his health was failing, slowing his writing and filling his days with pain. He underwent surgery in January 1936 for an undiagnosed perforated duodenal ulcer and died within the week. This is the funeral service program in Westminster Abbey. His pallbearers included his cousin, Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, as well as the senior officers of Great Britain's armed services. And the marble casket, covered with a Union Jack, was carried for interment in the Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, next to the grave of Charles Dickens and Thomas Hardy. The most richly compensated writer of his time in the English language, and from 1890 to 1920, the most popular and financially successful author in the world. With extraordinary sales through the British Empire, but also, of course, in this country and in foreign translations in at least 37 languages, he left an estate which today would be valued at over 11 million pounds. In 1941, 5 years after the poet's death, T.S. Eliot edited A Choice of Kipling's Verse, the title for the book, with the word verse not reflecting the higher value of the word poetry. But this greatest of the English language modernist poets had served as a vice president of the Kipling Society. He found that Kipling had, quote, an immense gift for using words, an amazing curiosity and power of observation with his mind and all his senses, the mask of an entertainer, and beyond that, a queer gift of second sight, of transmitting messages from somewhere, a gift so disconcerting when we are made aware of it that thenceforth we are never quite sure when it is not present. All this, he continued, makes Kipling a writer impossible wholly to understand and quite impossible to belittle. In March 2013, Professor Thomas Pinney published with Cambridge University Press the first ever complete poems of Rudyard Kipling in 3 volumes, the last of the 3 volumes, including poems never collected for the publishers in the author's lifetime, and fully 50 written inside books given to friends or dashed off in letters or even on napkins, which had never been published at all. And his work was more than simply the poetry of which many of us know. The American critic Randall Jarrell has written, quote, "After you have read Kipling's 50 or 75 best short stories, you realize that few men have written this many stories of this much merit, and that very few have written more and better stories." Christopher Benfey, the professor of English at Mount Holyoke, has recently published a book entitled If, The Untold Story of Kipling's American Years. Here is the cover. I disagree that this story was untold, but he wrote the following with which I do agree. Quote, "For Kipling, America was a place of promise, of freedom, of experimentation, relatively free in his view from the class and caste divisions that marred England and India, a place where he could reinvent himself, as so many American writers have done before him. If Kipling had his own sense of America," Benfey goes on, "Americans developed their own versions of Kipling, independent of what British or Indian readers made of them. He was the most influential writer of his time in the United States. It was largely through Kipling that naturalism, the Darwinian view that environment determines character and that only the fit survive, entered mainstream American literature. It was partly through Kipling that the cult of the strenuous life in the wild, in the jungle, or the desert, among soldiers or among wolves, entered American writing. And," he continues, "it was Kipling who introduced to the reading public the romance of the war correspondent, With the Light That Failed, and the international spy, Kim, the favorite book of Allen Dulles, the first director of the CIA, those interlocking heroes of 20th century popular literature and film. His work," Benfey says, "profoundly influenced a generation of American writers, including Willa Cather, Stephen Crane, Jack London, and later Ernest Hemingway. Kipling became the writer we know in large part because of this deep involvement with the United States." Close the Benfey quote. That influence continues to this day. Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan, to Kipling's annoyance, was little more than an inferior remake of the Jungle Books, Benfey notes, and Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are an inspired tribute to it. Max, the latter-day Mowgli, wears his wolf suit when he goes out on his night journeys. And Hemingway, never shy about his own writing genius, respectfully said that Kipling was a greater one. And in the larger grand strategy, political, military sphere, we can reflect on 2 more modern cultural echoes of Kipling. The first is John Huston's film version of The Man Who Would Be King in 1975, an explicit engagement with imperial overreach and folly, having an unsettling resonance with Vietnam and with later American wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, in the breezy confidence of Daniel Dravid and Peachy Carnahan in their prospects for success in the imaginary Kafiristan. The second is the anecdote with which I began these remarks, the story of the printed T-shirts of the British soldiers in Basra in the Gulf War about roll into your rifle to prevent mutilation while wounded, which reminds us that, as George Orwell put it, Kipling, quote, sees clearly that men can only be highly civilized while other men, inevitably less civilized, are there to guard and feed them, close quote. Kipling mapped out this territory already in his poems and stories written so long ago, which seem so accurately to capture the overconfident promises of politicians, as well as the terrifying experiences of soldiers and officers in these dismal wars. Let me conclude with twin stories about two little Kipling books, which I hope more than a book collector can love. On September 2nd, 1914, there appeared in both the Times in London and in American newspapers, Kipling's poem, For All We Have and Are. Remember, I told you he was not writing for money, but sending inspirational verses to the newspapers. And it begins, for all we have and are, for all our children's fate, stand up and take the war. The Hun is at the gate. It ends, there is but one task for all, one life for each to give. Who stands if freedom fall? Who dies if England live? Over in Washington, D.C., Franklin Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of State. And unlike his superiors in the War Department and the White House, with President Wilson, wanted to go to war with the Allies. His wife, Eleanor's aunt, Maud Hall Gray, was married to David Gray, later to be appointed FDR's ambassador to Ireland in 1940. And the couple printed as a Christmas keepsake in 1914, this 8-leaf pamphlet entitled not on the side, but on the cover. Please show that again, Hollister. Two Kinds of Courage. Hollister, can you put the image back up? The name was taken from an editorial printed in the Times on the kinds of courage it would take to survive through and prevail in what was now the Great War. This little pamphlet included two poems, one by Rabindranath Tagore, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913, 6 years after Kipling, and Kipling's poem, which I just read part of, For All We Have and Are. What you see here is the only known copy of this pamphlet, which in the book collecting game is the first edition of this poem, anything between paper or hardcovers, in a presentation copy to Dear Eleanor and Franklin, with our love, Maud and David, which came on the market when the library at Eleanor's retreat, Valkill at Hyde Park, was sold at auction at Christie's in 2001. As I said, Kipling did not wish to be paid for any literary work he produced during the war, and so this poem was not collected between hardcovers by Kipling until 1919, 5 years after the Hyde Park Christmas card in his book, The Years Between. The next image is the title page of the first English edition of The Years Between in 1919. Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt in November 1914 did not, of course, ask the English author for his permission to reprint the poem, and he surely never even knew about it. But the poem's inclusion in this privately printed Christmas favor is strong evidence of the sentiment of the Roosevelts and their immediate circle about what America should be doing in the newly erupted, appalling conflict, one we did not join for another several years. This is a portrait of the elderly and frail Kipling not long before his death. And the second pamphlet I want to tell you about is ungainly titled Unpublished Items by Rudyard Kipling, and it did not appear until 1943. Here again, though, there's a connection with FDR, now President of the United States, in a world war which followed the Great War, which it occasioned For All We Have and Are. Kipling had died in 1936, long before the war started, but after Hitler's rise and after the appropriation of the swastika, he banned from his books because of that. The surgeon who attended Kipling at Middlesex Hospital, the Dr. Alfred Webb Johnson, had received from Kipling's widow the texts of 3 poems, They were titled, respectively, The Burden of Jerusalem, commenting on the perennial conflict of the Arabs and the Jews. And the basic theme was a plague on both your houses. The second was called A Chapter of Proverbs, 32 pithy and somewhat cynical epigrams in mock biblical language. And the third was a quatrain titled President Wilson. Mrs. Kipling had decided all three were entirely too controversial to include in the final collected edition of Kipling's works, the Sussex edition, published after his death, bound in native tan Niger goatskin. And manuscripts of the first two titles were gifted to the British Library by Webb in 1940. The third, President Wilson, reads in full, "He rests beneath the earth he made his own, and once more, God is running things alone." You can see the problem with publication. In 1943, as the Second World War raged, Webb Johnson, then serving as president of the Royal College of Surgeons, had these poems hand-lettered by a calligrapher and bound up in two sets in 3/4 Morocco, about 7.5 by 5 inches in size. He presented the first set to Prime Minister Winston Churchill on the latter's admission as an honorary member of the College of Surgeons. Now, Churchill was always a great fan of anything Kipling. He had quoted The Absent-Minded Beggar in Parliament in 1904. And in a speech at the Kipling Memorial Fund dinner in 1937 after the poet's death, said that, quote, "Two immortal poems or passages of English command admiration without distinction of party or mood," close quote, naming Recessional and If, and saying that they should, quote, "be learned by heart by every good Englishman." Winston's famous parliamentary speech, by the way, "We shall fight on the beaches," even echoed Kim with his scene where the seal pups are, quote, "fighting on the beaches, fighting in the surf," close quote. Tickled to have what was effectively forbidden fruit from his favorite poet, now deceased, Churchill then asked Webb Johnson to have the second set of these three verses sent to FDR as part of the Prime Minister's constant wooing of the president for the American military support, which was Britain's lifetime. This is a picture of Churchill and Roosevelt meeting in Quebec in 1943. In Roosevelt's letter of thanks to the Prime Minister of October 43, now bound with the Royal College of Surgeons copy, together with the correspondence of Webb Johnson and Churchill, describing distribution of the first two copies, FDR's letter of thanks alluded to the explosive nature of the verses, "The Burden of Jerusalem," which, as I said, basically damned both the quarreling houses of the Jews and the Arabs, the Balfour Declaration not quite working out. "Perhaps," FDR wrote the Prime Minister, "the burden of Jerusalem should wait until you and I are strong enough to carry Ibn Saud to Jerusalem and Dr. Weizmann to Mecca," close quote. Churchill's set of these poems seems to have disappeared. It's not to be found in his archives at Churchill College, Cambridge. I was privileged to examine Roosevelt's copy in the bookshelves of the replica of the Oval Office at Hyde Park. And the only other known copy is now in my collection at Yale. This is William Strang's etching of Kipling with his characters as puppets, Gunga Din, and others. Rudyard Kipling, Bard of the American Empire, long after he left these shores, and even after his death, still influenced by his words and message, the grand strategy of this country in 2 world wars. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, David. I'm looking at the questions. I think we're a little short on time, but we could do a few. Jim Fishbein asks, do you know who or what experience inspired his major works like Jungle Books? He wrote an amazingly diverse range of themes.
Well, it was his being raised in India to the age of 6, and then going back out at the age of 17 and writing on the newspapers, interviewing soldiers, doing political work. And, yet still with enormous imagination. And remembering his Indian childhood, stories like Rikki Tikki Tavi, he then entertained his own children with the Just So stories, The Cat That Walked By Itself, How the Camel Got His Hump, and the rest. And then later used some of his American experience to write short stories. So he really used up what his life had thrown up, what his travel had thrown up throughout the empire and in the United States. So yes, his range was remarkably diverse and expressed in novels and poems and short stories.
Did his efforts in the 1890s for a reunion of Anglo and America gain any traction in the U.S.? How is that?
They did, not so much in the U.S. because the Irish were not happy about that thought at all, having fled from the famine. But it was strongly promoted for a decade. You'll even find a Sherlock Holmes story, A Noble Bachelor, where Sherlock expresses the author Doyle's disdain for how George III messed things up. But it lasted for 10 years, and then the geopolitical plates shifted. Britain went into an alliance with Russia and France, and therefore could balance off Germany, and the energy for that drained away. But for 10 years, many Americans and Englishmen thought about it, and Andrew Carnegie, even above his Scotland castle, had sewed together a Union Jack and an American flag. So there was enthusiasm. It showed in that Piers advertisement that I showed you, but it changed when the world changed.
Arthur Stapleton asks, what was Kipling's citizenship?
Oh, well, he was certainly, as the British in India did, considered himself an Englishman. He was born in Bombay. I don't know whether they had the notion of birth citizenship with regard to parentage, but as the child of an English man and a woman, he always considered himself an Englishman, and if they had passports, that's what he would have been carrying. But he traveled all over the world, and as I said, to South Africa for about 18 years.
His father, John Kipling, was sent to the Raj to teach young Indians how to do ceramics and pottery. Was this part, and he was also an employee of the Victoria Albert Museum, was this part of a larger strategy to introduce, say, Western trades and Western arts to India? And can that be considered part of the white man's burden, fulfilling the contract of teaching other people, other countries?
I think that probably might be a fair characterization. The notion was to teach advanced ceramic skills so that Indians could design and produce pottery as they did in the potteries in England, where Kipling's parents met, for export income. And certainly we saw it too with the cotton trade, where the Indian cotton industry became oriented toward feeding the British Empire as well. So yes, and Kipling's father taught at a school and maintained the museum, which is still there, and the gun on which Kim sits in the illustration to the frontispiece of Kim, Zam Sama, a great Mughal cannon which had been dragged down there, is still today just outside that building.
I'm going to cut it off here, David. I want to thank you for a fantastic talk, a sweeping narrative. Certainly the man had a full life, and your talk sort of gave us a panorama of both the cultural and geopolitical landscape of the 40 years of his active career. David, lovely words. Thank you very much.
Happy to do it. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Thank you.
With that, we'll end the meeting.